seems quite clear to me that Ferrari are not as prepared for Lewis Hamilton's arrival as they would like to be, and that 2025 could be a very complicated year for everybody in Maranello. Now, I'm not saying they're doomed to failure, no, not at all. It just means that the first year together might be the most awkward, or it could entirely explode. Yeah. After realizing that you're probably fed up with hearing about Lando Norris's team leader status being cast into doubt and the Checo debate being dragged out, although do let me know in the comments whether or not you'd like to hear me and the Foam of Doubt talk about all of the conspiracy theories attached to it. So thanks to your feedback, we're going to be turning our attention toward Ferrari and what they need to do to be ready for the incoming cultural phenomena that is Lewis Hamilton, and why they might be slightly panicking. You see, 6 months ago, when the news initially broke that Lewis Hamilton was leaving Mercedes and headed to Ferrari, both teams were in very different positions. Ferrari looked like, under the tenure of Fred Vasseur, that they had managed to steady the ship somewhat and were about to head toward calmer seas, whereas Mercedes were just about treading water, having realised that, yeah, the zero-pod concept wasn't going to work, and they managed to just about hang on to second place in the Constructors. However, the Scuderia still looked the more assured of the two, and the early part of this year simply exacerbated that sentiment. Mercedes were reeling with issues regarding cooling, and a tricky rear end which Lewis particularly is not partial to, whereas Ferrari had seemingly built themselves quite the strong and stable car for this year, which both drivers got along with just fine, thank you very much. And that really fueled the idea that Ferrari could finally be in contention to fight for the Constructors' Red Bull for the first time since the beginning of 2022. Yeah, that's all very well and good. But here's my first point as to why I think Ferrari aren't quite ready for Lewis Hamilton. They're not fully optimised for him. You see, in the throes of a full-on development war, Ferrari's first arguably since 2018, or maybe the first half of 2022 when it comes to title bids, I'm not talking about years where they had to develop themselves to get themselves back on their feet and being in the front-running pack. Ferrari threw their first roll of the dice okay with their Imola package, but when it became obvious that Red Bull threw us snake eyes with their tweaks to the RB20, Ferrari decided to bet double or nothing with rushing in their Silverstone tweaks for Spain and, well, their roll of the dice failed so hard that it fell off the table and into a nearby aquarium where a certain pop voice said, "Ciao, Ferrari. Di nuovo indietro." I think it's safe to say that whilst the rest of the grid has been able to get a handle on the bouncing issue, even the likes of the Mercedes, who were reportedly one of the high-profile victims a couple of years ago, Ferrari were just as riddled with the problem. Although admittedly the former was far more vocal about it, they tried to get the FIA to change the rules about it to favour them, they did, and then it ended up being even worse for them, so it might have been better if they just held their tongue and then just gotten on top of the problem, but then they didn't. But Mercedes did have to do something about it, as Lewis Hamilton was one driver suffering from the constant bouncing, which was a valid concern, as it could lead to back problems for all of the drivers, if not now, but in the future. For me, this was an even more pressing matter than drivers' weights. That was a really big problem not that long ago, where drivers had to get ridiculously thin in the pursuit of lap times being as quick as possible. Thankfully, there are things in place to keep drivers' weights in check, and now they're actually increasing the weight limit for next year to 800 kilograms flat, so that means the drivers can put on a little bit more muscle. But, oh, I see what you're doing, FIA. You're increasing the weight limit to make the 2026 weight reduction look even more impressive. Oh, cheeky. So naturally, the biggest priority for Ferrari is to fix the bouncing issue pronto, or else they could be in with a very tricky situation and a very angry Lewis. Vasseur has said just that this is one of the major issues Ferrari hopes to deal with and actually overcome. Fixing the bouncing is a step in performance, so for sure we are pushing like hell to bring something, and we will do it as soon as possible. I think it's quite impossible to simulate the bouncing because you can see that from session to session, when the wind changes direction or whatever, that the bouncing can appear or disappear, that it's really marginal. We are all really on the edge of this. We have some metrics to imagine if we'll be in a better shape or not, but at the end of the day, we are also pushed by the performance that we could gain with a bit more downforce sometimes. The issue is that we are developing much closer to the limit, and at the end of the day, we are always playing with this bouncing to stay close, and if you overshoot, you have to do a step back. Oh, Fred, really? You had a really good car at the beginning of the year which appealed to Charles, and now you're on the limit again, which is something Charles Leclerc does not like. And yes, whilst this is a reasonable explanation and it does make sense, the other reason they need to solve this is that Lewis is coming aboard, and they need to ensure he does not succumb to the problem at all in his first year with the team, because it might not make a good first impression. But yeah, you could easily argue as well that after 2025, it won't really matter so much. The idea of porpoising it'll be cast into the realms of history. It's mostly about the top-end era, the stuff that you can see, as well as pure engine grunt, like it was before 2022. And if Ferrari dedicate themselves mostly to next year fixing the porpoising issue for good, it might all be meaningless, as time and resources might have been better suited to get a handle on the new regulations where the ground effect solution is not a priority. It's a balancing act. For sure, this could be a problem that is negated because the FIA has stipulated that teams can make mule cars that are allowed to test the rigors of the 2026 regulations, and that might mean that older cars can be brought back into play again, not just the 2022 cars. And that means Lewis Hamilton's experience in that kind of machinery will be really, really important and a real boon for Ferrari. Before 2022, Lewis's experience with the dominant Mercedes might be really beneficial, especially with the W11 and how that worked. And even Leclerc might get something out of it too, because those Ferraris were where he cut his teeth, and he had his groove, especially in 2019. So yeah, the whole porpoising issue, it might not be so bad. It might cause a little bit of friction at the beginning, but going forward into the future years with Lewis Hamilton, his experience with the older machinery, especially the 2017 through 2020 cars, that could be a real advantage and might settle him in much better. It really is going to be interesting which car Ferrari chooses to make their mule car. That sounds good in theory, but it could still be a little bit tricky, but we'll see about that. So just pencil that in as something to consider, but it's not absolutely deal-breaking. But there are a couple of points which I want to share with you right now, which could be all the more bombastic. I mean, some of you might enjoy it, but personally, I'm dreading it. I will get to the major elephant in the room that most modern journalists tend to overlook, but the real one that is indicative of a turbulent first year is the matter regarding driving styles. Now, F1 Unchained made a really good video a few weeks back, really illustrating the differences that Lewis Hamilton has in terms of driving style, and Mickey does make a really good point in his video. I seriously recommend watching this, of course, after this video. Charles and Lewis have differing ways of driving, with the former preferring front-end precision, kind of like Verstappen prefers it in a way, and the latter wants a rear end to bite in with, and work with him, especially with him liking to brake much later than most drivers. But at the same time, that really doesn't work well with the long-lasting belief that the Ferrari is pretty hot when it comes to tyre degradation, and having a car with a lot of front-end brake balance is going to cause a lot more heat to be generated in those tyres, and trying to make the car steer, it's going to really play havoc with the idea and the concept that Ferrari has fostered in the last couple of years. And it's also why the initial spec of this year's Mercedes car was not working with Lewis either, as it needed that interesting looking front wing to try and make up the basic deficit of not having that much rear end grip. It's not just that either. Do you recall the struggles that Lewis was having in 2022 and 2023, when the concept of the W13 and 14 respectively was mainly to do with having a really weird balance that he didn't quite like, and that it was mostly at the front end? Well, they did address that this year to bring it back as per Lewis's request, and now everything is back to where it was. It's working wonders, and now he has 2 wins under his belt. Recent Ferraris have leaned to a cockpit design that leans toward a front-end based car. The cockpit is slightly further forward than the current Mercedes. And even though Lewis has been able to adapt to that mode of doing things, he was able to show glimpses of potential throughout those couple of years, Ferrari will want him to hit the ground running and be happy almost immediately when he arrives in Maranello. And even though Leclerc has vocalised that at the beginning of the year, the SF24 was a far more neutral car, more versatile, more capable of him being able to drive it without having to really bring it to the ends of its limits and maybe overreaching them. That sounded fantastic. And even the Imola upgrade sounded potentially good. Leclerc was getting podiums. It was all working. Monaco, he gets the win. Fantastic. And now he suddenly doesn't have it anymore, and hopefully he might get it back. But either way, you cannot deny that Ferrari have lost months of development. They've lost their technical director who helped design the car, they got to find somebody else, and I've really not touched upon Adrian Newey, but that is a really major factor. I really hope that whoever Ferrari chooses to design the car going forward really is somebody who can cater to the desires and wants and needs of Lewis, as well as Charles, so we cannot ignore him either, because you want both drivers to perform, because it's becoming quite clear now. Everything is so close, you need both drivers to be scoring points regularly. The concept of having one really strong driver and one so-so driver that works so well for Mercedes and Red Bull as of late, that ain't gonna cut it anymore, especially for next year. What Ferrari needs to do is to adapt next year's car toward Lewis's driving style and cockpit configuration if they wish to get the best out of him and get a good return on their investment in the first year. And this isn't going to be just like a one and done deal or anything like that. Lewis isn't just making a cameo appearance before the new regulations come in and then call it a day, hoping to do everything in 1 year. According to Fred via Financial Times, Lewis is locked in currently to a 3-year deal, going through all the way into 2027. That's when he can make a decision about whether or not he wants to continue, or whether he wants to call it a day and then kick on to the next stage of his Ferrari collaboration, if things are still good with them and things haven't gone frosty, which they could if they don't perform, is that he becomes a brand ambassador and that Ferrari becomes a global mega brand. But in the here and now and going into 2025, Ferrari's car needs to be less on the nose in order to get the most out of their new hire in their last year of this spec of vehicle, and Leclerc needs to be the one to adapt to it from next year. And the situation has been made all the more awkward since Mercedes has been able to actually listen to Lewis Hamilton, and what did it get them? It got them a car which is getting Lewis wins again. Lewis is statistically back in the game. Since Spain 2016, when Max Verstappen acquired his first victory, Lewis now has more wins than Max. Whether or not this could lead to Lewis being a factor in the championship, which some people are speculating about, no, that's not really on the cards for this year, as we're mostly quibbling about Lando being a factor, and he's 49 points ahead of Hamilton, so this year, I don't think so. Next year though, if Ferrari do put their eggs in a row, yeah, could be. And with that brings a lot more pressure into the Scuderia to maintain that good form, as well as having to deal with the next point that I wish to bring to your attention, that most outlets tend to not notice: the fans. Okay, to be fair, a lot of outlets out there do recognise the sheer enormity of Lewis Hamilton's fandom, not just in Formula 1. Ferrari will receive a huge amount of attention on all fronts, including commercial, financial and social gains from bringing Lewis Hamilton into the fold. It's going to be maximised the moment Lewis Hamilton steps out of Brackley and comes to Maranello. But one thing I don't think Ferrari is prepared for is the sheer enormity of the reach that both Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc will have. It is going to be the biggest in Formula 1, not just now, but in the entire history of the sport. And I'm not talking about Charles and Lewis specifically. Those two men are very, very keen to get along with one another. That was a really good exercise of them to really chat more while they're at different teams, and for them to get to know one another on a social level and a personal level, especially introducing their dogs together, little Leo and Roscoe. That's pretty wholesome. I do appreciate those two for being mature on that front. I can't say the same thing necessarily for the overall fan base. Up until now, Lewis's teammates post Nico Rosberg have had much smaller profiles in social media spheres. You could argue that Nico had a fair share of fans, but back in 2016, the sport barely recognised the medium of social media that was Twitter and maybe Instagram, because Bernie Ecclestone was simply not interested in it. He said this many times, including in many publications, that he didn't pay any interest into young people whatsoever because they didn't have any money. What was the point of catering to them? They wouldn't bring extra moolah for his own back pocket. No, go after their grandparents, the rich execs who could willingly drop tens of thousands of dollars for paddock passes and sponsorship banquets and meals and social gatherings. That's the kind of money that Bernie wanted in Formula 1. The entire idea of how sport is consumed and digested and shared amongst the populace has evolved, and it needed to evolve Formula 1. Otherwise, it would have just been that old fuddy-duddy little sport that maybe your parents watched or something like that. It wasn't cool, it wasn't trendy, it wasn't in the now, and it's not going to transcend generations to come. And trust me, as a newly minted parent, I really like what F1 is doing with that new kids coverage and bringing people into the sport. Hamilton's had it relatively easy when compared to Rosberg, and that was before social media really took hold in the sport. Bottas and Russell, yes, I know Russell's really active on social media and he does have his fans. They pale in comparison in terms of numbers to Lewis Hamilton's following. Bottas, no, he didn't really push that boat, he didn't push that envelope, he played ball, and therefore Lewis Hamilton fans do appreciate Bottas, especially when you compare him to Checo now, and how Bottas was always in Q3 throughout his entire tenure at Mercedes. But trust me, when Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton join forces at Ferrari, it's going to be taken to a level that we have never seen before. It does not even come close. I am warning you. It is going to be cataclysmic. And I'm not just pulling this take out of my bottom either. Thanks to this handy dandy chart from Blinkfire, George Russell has a sixth of the followers that Lewis has, while Charles Leclerc has more than Max Verstappen and is second only to Lewis. But what makes this interesting is that more people talk about Leclerc than Hamilton, by around about 19 million social media interactions last year alone. Oh, TikTok though? Oh no. Lewis and Leclerc? No, absolutely not. Not even after the Leclerc meme. No, TikTok, that's Fernando's kingdom. And the stats in 2025, they're going to be looking at these stats from 2023 and going, oh, that's cute. Irrespective of how well the Ferrari car performs, Charles and Lewis's results will be scrutinized intensely by either faction. And even though Ferrari is the most popular motorsport brand out there, no question, hands down, it has a legacy that no other car company can rival. Ferrari still has some work to do to really appeal to modern social media. And even though they have done their best with the whole C2 movement of Charles and Carlos together, it's a lot better than it was a few years ago when they didn't really try, when it was Seb and Kimi. They still haven't really got much to hold a candle to when it comes to Aston Martin and TikTok, for example. Because as we've seen with George Russell, as we did last year, and the year before that, if Charles does better than Lewis, then there will be cries of sabotage. I bet you. That Ferrari are only using Lewis's presence there for personal gain. And if Lewis does better than Charles, then there'll be outcries that the team are casting aside their previously favoured driver for personal gain. No, that is so not right. It really isn't. This is not how things are supposed to be. All this is going to do is going to stir up hatred amongst both camps. It's going to make Ferrari the most toxic team out there. Mercedes, oh, it'll be just a walk in the park. Mercedes with George and Lewis, oh, that's small fry compared to all of the discourse that's going on between Charles Leclerc fans and Lewis Hamilton fans. Yes, you might be thinking I'm a little bit cynical, but come on. The evidence is clear as daylight. It's out there for all to see. It's a distraction that I think nobody wants at Maranello, nor do I think they're prepared to deal with, considering they're just dipping their toes into modern-day social media experiences. And all this coming at a really critical time for the team, when Red Bull are really dropping the ball at the moment. This is a golden opportunity for any team, not just McLaren and Mercedes, to take away both titles for the last year before the new regulations come in. And also, this is a really important moment for Lewis Hamilton, because he's going to be entering a brand new culture he's never experienced before. Throughout his time at Formula One, he has never been at a non-British based team. Yes, Mercedes is technically registered as German, but they're based in Brackley, so there is a difference there. And even though Charles Leclerc has gone up against a multiple world champion before in the form of Sebastian Vettel and come out on top, compared to Vettel, no, Lewis is the final boss in that regard. Both drivers need to be fully aware of the power of their own influence online, not just as racers, because if they don't, and the vitriol between their respective camps gets to bursting point, something that's never been tested in this modern age of Formula One, it could end up being a major distraction for themselves and the Scuderia, and it could spend a lot of their time trying to put out fires online and tame things, or simply having to ignore the fandom, which will make them even feel more aggrieved. It's going to be a never-ending cycle that will just not go away. It'll snowball, all into the benefit of all of their major competitors. Because as we've seen with Charles Leclerc, he's had his ups and downs, and I dread to think what's going to happen next year if he's attacked online. It's something I'm really concerned about, and I know that a lot of people out there are really looking forward to all of the chaos that is about to befall it, but no, that's not my cup of tea. That's just my honest opinion. It's a serious consideration, which Toto Wolff is all too aware of. Mercedes will be happy to see the back of all of that, and you get the sense that Wolff doesn't really care all that much if he's hated by Lewis's fans anymore. That's not going to be his problem soon. And also, like I touched upon earlier, Lewis is starting to win again, not at Ferrari. Instead, he's doing that at Mercedes. The team has been able to turn it around, and has been able to give Lewis a parting gift that, yeah, sure, there were a couple of years where there were a lot of problems, there was a lot of strife, they were trying to figure themselves out, they have now figured themselves out, they're now in a good place, comparatively speaking. And you might be able to argue, well, Fred has experience with working with Lewis Hamilton, surely he'd be able to deal with him, right? Well, that was before Formula One really took hold in his day-to-day life, where he couldn't go anywhere without being tapped or recognised. And because Mercedes is winning again, and Ferrari is really struggling to even get on the podium, it's going to make the middle third struggles of this year all the more important to fix. Look, I have no expectations for Lewis Hamilton in his first year with Ferrari. It's going to be a learning exercise, but okay. If he ends up winning in the opening races of 2025 like Sebastian Vettel did, then fantastic, fair play. If he takes half a season to get settled in, fair enough. If it's a case of looking to the new regulations in 2026 and using next year to really transition into Italian team properly, no worries. I just hope that Scuderia Ferrari are ready for this, for the most influential lineup on the grid. I'm not talking about just in terms of skill or potential or in terms of track success. No. Social media influence is a major factor in the modern era of Formula One. Lewis and Charles are the two most popular drivers in the sport. They are now going to be teammates, and it's going to be absolutely intense. And okay, I understand if it's not your cup of tea, that you're not interested in that side of Formula One and you think it's a drag on the entire sport. I get that. You might not care, but a lot of people do. And it's really wise to acknowledge their existence. Like it's wise to acknowledge the significance of Sainz's decision to snub Audi and Alpine for Williams. Something of which I discuss more of in this video here that you can go and watch next. And by the way, we're on the road to 100,000 subscribers, so if you enjoyed this video, do give me a cheeky subscribe if you can. Cheers!